Welcome, everybody. Uh, Thank you for joining us today. Today, we are pleased to have Eric MacNaughton from City of Calgary, and he will be presenting his work on the City of Calgary Transportation COVID recovery scenarios. Eric has just over 20 years of experience in transportation engineering and urban planning, including 15 years working at the City of Calgary. He has worked on a variety of projects at the city, including leading development of the 2009 Calgary Transportation Plan, creation of Calgary's electric and low emissions vehicles strategy, and supporting the city's COVID executive response group in coordinating non emergency response actions to the COVID pandemic. Following on the completion of the transportation COVID recovery scenarios, Eric also became a member of the Association of Professional Futurists and is continuing to develop his strategic foresight skills. Welcome, Eric, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Usman. So welcome, everyone. And yeah, I'll give an overview today of the work that we did. This is mostly about May through July 2020. So just to give you some context, it was sort of during and coming out of the first wave of the pandemic. So maybe I'll just proceed here. There was sort of three different pieces at the time that we were focused on at the City of Calgary Transportation Department specifically as the pandemic hit. So there were three streams that were part of our recovery framework. One, looking at the immediate financial implications, particularly in our case, the Calgary Transit, although other departments had things like recreation were significantly impacted as well. And so that was very focused on our short-term budget response. We also had a second stream that was focused on what we call flexible service plans. How are we going to adjust in and out of different levels of service? We normally said over 18 months. I think we're all still being a little optimistic about how long this is going to last. And then the part that I was leading was the third stream, which was really trying to get a handle on what might be different, what might be the sort of medium to long-term impacts of the pandemic on transportation as a whole. And this linked back to some work that we had done back in 2017, 2018 called The Future of Transportation in Calgary. It was a little more focused, I'd say, on the technological aspects of change and how that could affect the transportation system. But this, I think, really added value in sort of this additional dimensions beyond just technological changes that can have long-term impacts. I mean, a note on the slide here, I said it's looking out 20 years, which we did, but the scenarios are a bit of a blend looking at anything from, I'd say, about 2 to 20 years out from where we were last summer. So I think, as everyone here knows, it is fairly difficult to predict the future. I mean, obviously, we do a lot of modeling work in transportation to try to get a handle on what it can look like. But when we've got highly uncertain situations like we've had with COVID, sort of traditional modeling and projection methods don't really help us very well because there's just too many unknowns, just as Yoda has indicated here. So that's where we really start to focus on a technique called strategic foresight, which we've been using at the City of Calgary for a few years. Some of you might be familiar with it. At one level, it's a scenario planning tool. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the components of it in a minute. One of the things you can see on the right-hand side is just a handful of companies that make extensive use of foresight in their own strategic planning processes. I'd say Shell's probably the most well-known in this field. They were using strategic foresight back in the 1970s to successfully figure out how to navigate through the oil crisis that was happening at that time. And certainly the Conference Board of Canada uses it quite extensively with the federal government, and it's very commonly used by governments throughout Europe. So like I was saying, it's a scenario planning tool amongst other things. And I think one of the things that's really important that helps us address the high levels of uncertainty for something like COVID is that we're exploring a set of plausible futures. So they're not hard and fast forecasts. And next few slides, I'll kind of walk through some of the different aspects of developing a set of foresight scenarios to give you a little bit more feel for what that means. But it really then lets us stress test some of the assumptions we've got built into our existing services and strategic plans, and overall reduces the chance that we're going to get caught by surprise. It won't eliminate it. I mean, even if you do multiple different foresight processes, there's always going to be something you might not see. but it certainly improves the chances that we're going to catch different eventualities and be able to plan for them in advance. So it's great developing scenarios, but I think the key thing is then that we're actually making this actionable. We're actually saying, okay, so what tangible things can we do in response to what we're seeing coming out of the scenarios? And so, and again, in a way, it's really a form of risk management, but also identifying potential new opportunities that we may not have seen before. And I mean, certainly in the context of talking about municipal government, we still look at it in terms of this is about trying to achieve the city's medium to long-term strategic goals, although it might not be in the ways that we expected. You know, again, if we had certain assumptions about how we were going to get to certain outcomes, we might find that actually there's more or less effective methods to do that going through some of the scenario process. So one thing, especially just given the time of year right now, I just thought I would throw in, if you're looking for what I think is a really good reference document for how to do strategic foresight, this is actually a field guide to strategic foresight produced by a group called CoLab out of the government of Alberta that uses a zombie theme throughout the whole thing. So apart from getting a kick out of that, it actually does a really good job of laying out the different approaches to foresight. And one of the things I just thought I would emphasize here, and again, it's text heavy, so don't worry about reading all the details, but it's the idea that you don't always actually need to develop scenarios to actually make use of strategic foresight methodologies. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of these as they related to building our COVID recovery scenarios. But there's things that like called horizon scanning, which is just a continuous process of looking for potential different disruptions that may be coming our way. I think one of the things that's significant about good horizon scanning is that it's always looking outside of the field that you're working in. So it wouldn't, like if we're working in transportation, certainly you'd be looking at things like land use and that, but you might be looking at advances in artificial intelligence technology that are beyond things like autonomous vehicles. I mean, just one example I remember reading about a couple of years ago was a new artificial intelligence that was developed around doing medical diagnostics, but they pitted it against the world-leading chess artificial intelligence. And this medical AI taught itself chess in a few hours and beat the world-leading AI that was designed specifically for chess. And they said that the new AI was actually exhibiting characteristics of anticipating what its opponent was going to do. And so you can start to think about those types of advances in a totally different field and how that might relate to something like autonomous vehicles and that need to anticipate what another driver would do. So horizon scanning is a critical piece and it has to be quite broad. And then there's things like trend identification. I mean, far on this creating scenarios. Another one that's really interesting is the idea in foresight of creating sort of tangible artifacts of the future, something that's really important for engagement to give people a hands-on feel for what a future could look like, or even developing games that bring people in. And I've seen examples where they've had people go through gaming systems for a month and developing a better understanding of how people would respond to unexpected circumstances. So it's a pretty diverse field. And I was going to put a link to this particular field guide on, but it's one of those really horrendous, like, 3 or 4 line long links. I would just recommend searching for There May Be Zombies, and you'll find it for free on the internet here. So coming back to some of the specifics, and this ties in partly to what I was just saying about the horizon scanning. One of the big things is trying to identify what are the key drivers or signals of change. And so this is partly a research-based approach, but there's some structure that tends to be put around it. This is just a couple of examples. But we tend to want to look for what are sort of those drivers, emerging issues that are coming up. I mean, if you're familiar with the triple bottom lines, social, environmental, and economic, then STEEP is not a big stretch from that. It adds in technological and political dimensions. You can see this sort of card deck of potential different drivers of change produced by a company called ARP. Some of you might be familiar with. And it covers a range of things from energy to climate change, demographics. So this, making sure that we're, again, looking at a broad range of potential things that may impact the future. And I think one of the key things about drivers is they're not clear-cut trends. These are the things where we're still not clear how they're going to play out, but we know that just the fact that they're emerging will have some sort of meaningful impact on whatever system we're evaluating. In our case, usually transportation systems. And so again, you can identify these through continuous horizon scanning if you've got a function like that in place. I'll admit, in the case of doing the COVID recovery scenarios, it was more doing project-specific research. And I'll talk about a few of the things that we were looking at, but this was one that we weren't set up in advance to specifically look at pandemics, although it was going through an old Foresight scenario we did several years ago, and we did highlight pandemics as a risk, so we probably should have spent more time on that one. But you can basically try to the catch again with project-specific research is that it's a little bit narrower of a view. So this, again, don't worry about the level of text in this. I just threw this on as one example, and I'm not sure if you can see at the top that this was, so this is one of the templates we used for looking at a series of different drivers for a project. This one was specifically looking at remote work. So, it's overall trying to have a description, couple of sources. I think a key thing, and I notice this sometimes depending on who's doing research is, and again, any of you involved with the university, you should have at least 2 independent sources of data for anything that you're proposing as a potential driver. There were definitely more than 2 for this one. These were just 2 really good sources at the time that we quoted as part of a reference, but there was a fair bit more, as you can imagine, for this topic. And then right away, based on the research, even before we got into anything around scenario development, so a couple of questions we put to ourselves is trying to understand what are the long-term impacts of this driver on travel behavior, and were there any associated impacts on urban form and land use? And I think like in a lot of cities, increasingly we're seeing transportation and land use as sort of an integrated system. So those were our 2 focus areas. Now, one of the other things of what's a common concept in Foresight is called the cone of plausibility. So I'll try to explain this quickly, but this gets back to the idea that we want to make sure that our scenarios are plausible. It's not just anything that we can imagine, that there has to be something in the drivers of change that we're seeing, and it should be something that we're seeing today that's, I want to say quantifiable, but again, it's research, but you can actually point to something now and saying, okay, we can start to see how this could play out in the future. And so it's that idea of we're starting from today where, the cone's pretty small. We've got a fairly good sense of what today looks like, but then the cone gets bigger as you go over time because more and more uncertainty builds in. And that's where then you can see, we talk about the sort of a plausible range in the middle. You get into more speculative things at the edge. So they're still possible, less likely, there's less data and evidence to support them. But then you can start to develop a set of scenarios within that plausible range. One of the other things I think that's good in this diagram that highlights is the difference. The most probable scenario isn't necessarily always the preferred scenario. And I think it's one of the things that's worth keeping in mind with any planning process is, certainly when you're doing master plan, that kind of thing, we have a clear sense from research, from stakeholder engagement, what have you, what our preferred future is. Doesn't mean it's the most likely path. But again, that gets back to later. In a way, it's good when you go through a process like this. What's the gap between where you might wind up or between a set of different scenarios and where you want to be helps to start to find the actions you need to take to hopefully drive yourself more towards that preferred future. One of the other things, I'm just going to move my screen a bit here, is, again, the scenarios need to be plausible, but as one of my colleagues has said, and I agree with this, that they need to make you just a little bit uncomfortable too, because if they're not pushing a boundary, they're not giving us anything to explore, to consider how would we respond if a certain situation starts to emerge. So I'll leave it to you as I go through the scenarios in a couple minutes here to decide if they're really good scenarios or just acceptable scenarios, see what your reaction is to those. So in terms of doing scenario design, there's few different ways that you can do that. I'm just going to highlight 2 here quickly just to give you a sense of some of the possibilities. The most basic, straightforward approach, which I think is excellent for anyone that's starting in this field or who's working with people that are unfamiliar with Foresight, is just what's called the 2x2 scenario matrix. And so basically you just have two different drivers. One would be the y-axis and one would be the x-axis. And you say, okay, so what are two of the extremes that we might see for this driver? And then so each quadrant then is a different combination of how those drivers play out. So it gives you four usually fairly distinct scenarios to work with. The catch with it only lets you consider really two different variables. One of the things I think, though, that's important to highlight with that is we always try to get away from the idea of there being a good scenario or a bad scenario. What we're looking for is what's the range of possibility, again, kind of like with that cone. So you always have to ask yourself, it's like, okay, if you have a scenario that seems really idealistic and utopian, it's like, so what might be the downsides to the scenario? Because it's almost invariably something. Because if there wasn't, we probably would be going that direction. And at the same time with bad scenarios, quote unquote, like what are some of the positive possibilities that actually could still come out of this? And again, so it's really trying to look for what's the range of risks and opportunities. Another approach, it's called the data as generic images of the future. So there's really four fairly clearly defined scenarios in this one: to continue, collapse, discipline, and transform. You can look at a wider range of variables across these scenarios, like you can see in all the different rows. You can keep adding more if you want. So these ones can actually get very complex, but they do give you a lot of room to look at a lot of different possibilities. So of course, I use neither of these literally. I kind of borrowed from each of them for creating the Calgary transportation scenarios. I think what I create is a little more aligned with some of how the discussion around Calgary's future has been framed for a while, but I borrowed quite a bit from the data scenarios. So I'll start getting into what we created specifically for the City of Calgary. So the two key drivers we were looking at, the first one, just a given, it was looking at the pandemic's duration and severity, trying to get an understanding of that. And we worked a fair bit with Alberta Health Services to make sure we were understanding the potential range of possibilities there. The other one that's big for Calgary was looking at global energy demand, because I'm sure, as you're all aware, Calgary's still quite attached economically to the oil and gas sector. And so the effects on demand for that type of energy product being impacted by the pandemic, in addition to some of the impacts we're already experiencing, this was a big factor we wanted to look at. And then there were a few different emerging trends that we were looking at, but the two that really rose to the surface that we focused on in detail were the impacts of remote work, and then retail delivery services, again, with fewer people being able to go out and shop, and looking at how that trend was actually being accelerated. So, I mean, part of what we did was really built on a lot of research, but we also used the regional transportation model to do some analysis. And if any of you have worked with regional transportation models, this was ME3. When I say we did a quick analysis, you probably know there's no such thing as like a really quick analysis. These are very detailed, complex models. But we were able, over the course of a month, to do some really valuable analysis for one scenario that gave us a starting point when we were looking at remote work. So we focused on several of Calgary's main employment hubs. I mean, the downtown Calgary actually still accounts for about a quarter of our employment right now, so it's pretty substantial. There's several other office-oriented hubs across the city that you can see on the map. And then we were able to look at specific subcategories of jobs. So we didn't have to do an all or nothing in terms of, okay, either everybody's working or everybody's remote working, say in the downtown. We found that about 60% of jobs in the downtown could be done remotely. So we applied that filter to all four of these office clusters. Now, again, given just limited time, we had to look at just one scenario. So we chose to look at what would happen in the transportation system if we had 2 days of remote work on average per week. So a hybrid model, I think like we're starting to see emerge. The reason we picked 2 days was based on various researchers out there suggesting that that was the best mix in terms of the psychological health and well-being of employees, mixing kind of that private time at home with the more interactive time in an office. So that was kind of our baseline. So in terms of the findings from that, what was interesting to see is that on a citywide basis, there was almost no impact. I think it was 2% reduction in the amount of automobile use across the city as a whole. The impacts are mostly downtown focused and certainly more heavily weighted to transit. So transit citywide, the reduction was 10%, almost all of that being tied to the downtown. Because, well, and actually I should say I've quoted here 25% less travel to the downtown. Total is correct, but there was a discrepancy we found between driving and transit, is that if you had 2 days a week remote work, you had actually about a 33% reduction in transit trips and more like a 20% reduction in automobile trips, partly because there was some more available parking came up, and that just kind of reflecting that if there's capacity, that desire for more people to drive. And we didn't even fiddle with the parking prices, and downtown Calgary has very expensive parking prices. So if we'd fiddled with parking prices, I suspect you would have seen even more of a discrepancy between transit and driving. So that was a fairly important finding. So now that brings us to the three scenarios. So I'll walk you through the three of them quickly here. I'm just checking myself for time. So the first one is what we called rapid recovery. This is the closest to coming back to a business as usual scenario. So, and then you can see we had some categories we were looking at that were consistent across them. So the pandemic itself in this scenario, and remember, this was being created spring, summer of 2020. And I think there was still the belief, even looking at the research, that we might actually see an end to the pandemic by early 2021. That clearly didn't happen. But I think right away, that in itself highlights the value of a Foresight scenario approach, is because there were quite a few of us at the city saying, okay, well, this could still be possible. If we just planned around that, we would not have been prepared for the extended disruption that we're seeing. So the scenarios even just enabled the conversation about that may not be the case. Some of the other things we looked at in this scenario, actually seeing for the economy that global stimulus, national stimulus would really spike demand for oil and gas and increase travel. We are seeing that playing out to some extent. I mean, certainly we went from essentially negative value for price of oil like a little over a year ago to, I think we're around $80 a barrel. Could potentially see a temporary spike up to $100 a barrel just because demand is exceeding supply growth for a short period of time. So that does seem to be playing out a bit. In terms of urban growth, we said it would be steady, but moderate. It'd still be focused more on the suburbs, which is consistent with what Calgary's seen anytime we've had any sort of economic boom in the past. Our municipal finances would be sufficient but unpredictable because the oil and gas sector is cyclic, and so we consistently ride the roller coaster out here. This is the scenario where we included the baseline 2-day per week remote work. So that the remote work piece is probably the only big deviation from what I would call business as usual in this scenario. And then looking at retail and delivery services, that there'd be a healthy mix of traditional retail and continued but gradual growth in home delivery. So the next one, and this is the one where, like I said, there's no bad scenarios, but there can be much more challenging scenarios, and this is one of them. So we called this one increased crisis. This one, the pandemic, says a severe second wave and that we would exit late 2021. Certainly, we've had a much more severe second, third, and fourth wave, but I think it did successfully capture the idea that we might see more significant impacts than we had experienced as of like June 2020. Saying full exit late 2021 might be a stretch, but certainly we're seeing changes now given vaccination. So there's something certainly in this scenario. Economy, this one, we are actually looking at the potential for global economic recession that would double whammy Calgary in terms of both just the overall reduced economic activity plus the reduced demand for oil and gas that could lead to a depression here. Fortunately, it did not get that severe, but I'd say we're seeing a more mild scale of that kind of economic impact all the same. Similarly, for urban growth, this one accounted for initial population and job losses in Calgary, followed by a long, slow recovery. That did happen to Calgary in the early 80s, again, tied to the oil and gas sector. And Alberta has seen a slight loss in population over the last year. So again, we are seeing a little bit of that play out. very constrained municipal finances. Maybe counterintuitively, this one, we had the least amount of remote work in any of the scenarios. We said if jobs were more scarce in the scenario, people might want to be seen in the office working hard, and so that there would be less average remote working happening. And then retail and delivery, this is one where we saw an overall retail decline period and more competition than between sort of low cost online shopping versus say more buy local campaigns. So, and then probably more of an impact on suburban retail, we thought, than main streets, just given main streets kind of have a little bit of more historic resilience. And then the last one we called transformational change. And so the pandemic, we said multi-year, multi-wave pandemic. Yes. I mean, we're already talking about the potential for a fifth wave here in Alberta. I'm not sure what you're expecting in Ontario. So, and this is important relative to the transformational change scenario, because this idea, even if the waves are not all as severe as each other, is that some level of continued disruption. The longer that goes on, the more that just starts to entrench some of the behavioral changes that have happened over the last year and a half. In terms of economy, this one was looking at, I mean, certainly back in 2020, there was more discussion. I mean, and there's still some now, but more discussion from the federal government about investments in green diversification. And that we were saying, okay, so what if Alberta saw a fair share of that investment to help us move the economy away from the oil and gas sector? Another piece that's a big deal with this one is this idea of globalized talent. I'll come back to that in a minute. In terms of growth, one of the things, this is one that we haven't seen in the end play out in Calgary, but I know has been playing out in Toronto. The idea that you'd see more growth in the region rather than in the city, and that just being driven by, again, if there's more remote work, you're less constrained by your physical location. What we didn't realize as clearly at the time that's a little clearer now is Calgary's housing market just isn't as expensive as, say, Toronto or Vancouver. So there's just not the same impetus for people to move out of the city, although the suburban housing market within the city has been quite strong. So we're still seeing a little bit of a shift there. Finances in this scenario, because we wouldn't be as tied to the oil and gas sector, they'd be more predictable, but probably more constrained than Calgary's maybe been accustomed to in the past. And then this one, again, this idea of globalized talent is that if you have more people say, you know, that you can work in Calgary, but you've got a job in Vancouver, you might even say live in the mountains near Calgary and you have a job in Toronto or something like that, is that, again, just less of a geographic tie. And so that you have a lot more remote work because you've got a lot more flexibility in where people can work around the world. And so this one, we're looking at 3+ days a week of remote work on average. And then retail delivery in this one primarily becomes online AI-based shopping with much more significant impacts than from delivery, whether that's from standard delivery trucks or even in 20 years out looking at ground-based or aerial drones. So it gives you a sense of some of the diversity in the scenarios. One of the things that we only touched on a little bit, so this is what's called a futures wheel. And I'm just putting it out there because for the most part, like you saw, we focused on transportation and urban form impacts. I think the retail starts to be what you would call a second order impact. So the idea of a futures wheel, and this is something we want to do going forward, at least some variation on this, to say, so if we've got sort of first order impacts, what are some second or third order impacts on other city services, on other aspects of society in Calgary that start to emerge from these scenarios? So it's just, this kind of gives you that sense of that growing web of interconnected implications. And so, yeah, and it's just a great way to start looking for more unexpected outcomes you might need to take action on. But again, getting back to that whole idea of action is sort of the critical part, is after we developed the scenarios, we then did a set of workshops with sort of our different service groups within, particularly the transportation department and also in planning. And over 80 individual recommendations came forward. Some of them were just reinforcing actions that we were already taking. Others were new actions. So we grouped these into sort of 15 main action categories. 8 of those were consistent across the 3 scenarios. And I always like looking for what's consistent in your scenarios. And so we called those low risk, high benefit, because basically no matter what, no matter how the different ways we saw the future could play out in these scenarios. And we know, I should emphasize too, we always knew no one of the scenarios was the future. You're going to see components of different scenarios in the real future. But if you see an action that makes sense across the board, it's a little like, why would you not do that? That's probably increasing our resilience regardless, as long as you have the resources to take the action. There were 7 more scenario-specific actions that we said we needed to monitor to see if and when they're appropriate to implement. And I won't go into, I'll show you the actions quickly here. I won't go into all the detail on that. And so if you've got any questions after, happy to answer those. But we did categorize them a little bit, saying that some of them we should be acting on immediately. Some of them should inform the development of other strategies coming up. And again, others we should just continue to monitor. So this is the first batch of 8 actions that are identified. And you can see that largely they're all act now. Of the 8 of them, I think the one I really want to highlight, though, is improved data collection and analytics to guide real-time decisions. And I mean, just one example of this is, you know, a lot of what I talked about impacts remote work related to our downtown. We only do a downtown cordon survey usually once a year. And that's really designed around, okay, we're going to track slow, steady change to downtown commuting over time. That's not that helpful when you're trying to track, you know, something that could be changing on a month-to-month basis with the unknowns of something like COVID. So this started to ask questions about, like, can we start to get aggregated cell phone data to start to understand travel behavior changes? Can we do more surveys? So this one was quite key. And there's other things I'll talk about in another slide here in just a moment, stress testing some of our strategic plans against the scenarios. We've been talking for a long time about a curbside management strategy being important. And this sort of really was just reinforcing the need for that. One, maybe I'll just highlight down near the bottom, number 7, offer new services to generate revenue. So this was really looking at the opportunity side of things. And one of the things that just emerged from doing some of the research was, okay, on the one hand, we're saying, okay, well, what if you see a protracted drop in the amount of transit ridership? I mean, obviously that's got revenue implications, which then has service implications. At the same time, saw some research, and I can't remember which university it was from, but they were saying the best way to extend the range of an aerial delivery drone would be to let it ride on the roof of an LRT or a bus, because it's going, you know, those vehicles are going through, you know, fairly central locations, and then the drone can just kind of hop off at the end to get to its final destination. So I remember asking one of my colleagues in transit, how much will we charge a drone? And he just goes, full fare, you know, it's like $325 or something. But like, even if the specific example isn't something you would pursue, it really starts getting your mind going about how else could we leverage this very expensive and very well positioned transit infrastructure. You know, if we start thinking about it more as just moving people, what are some of the other possibilities? And there are no definitive answers on that yet, but again, it just starts to, I think that's part of the value of doing Foresight scenarios. You start to ask other questions and look outside the boxes we usually look in. So then, just flipping to the next slide, these are the other 7 actions that were kind of only made sense in the context of 1 or 2 scenarios. So you can see most of them are monitor or inform strategies. Again, like, one of the things was thinking about what if we wind up with more inconsistent weekday travel, and the rapid recovery scenario. One of the things that emerged from that was, well, what if everyone decided that they should all be in the office on Wednesday? And so you had peak demand to your downtown, say, on Wednesday, but you had really low demand on Monday and Friday because a lot of people remote work. And I remember that was a big concern for our transit department, because that would mean they'd have to have a fleet of vehicles ready to go for this peak demand on Wednesday that would be sitting idle other days of the week. So that was actually really problematic. A little less problematic from a roads point of view in terms of traffic management. They felt they could address that. But again, it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, well, we need to see that data. How's travel of the downtown evolving over time to be able to decide whether or not we need to take any more specific action on that front. And there's just a few other similar examples like that throughout here. So in terms of just giving you examples, stress testing our strategic plans, we were looking at our municipal development plan and Calgary Transportation plan, which were just in the process of being updated during the pandemic. And then one of the things that really stood out was that the transformational change scenario actually enabled the types of changes we want to see in Calgary as a city, versus the rapid recovery scenario, going back to more of the same, was actually counter to what we're trying to achieve. So, I mean, there's only so much that we control in this. A number of the variables are outside our control, but it does start to ask the question about where might we want to try and nudge things if you really want to achieve these plans. We also did a sensitivity analysis of priority transit corridors. There's a number of BRT corridors that we're building, and there was an update report going on that. So looking at changes in, the dependency, I should say, on commuter demand and the dependency on sort of suburban growth were two key factors we looked at, and it was just another lens to look at how you might prioritize transit investments. So right near the end here now, we also did, one of my colleagues did, I think, a fantastic monitoring report looking at a number of metrics tied back to those actions I was just talking about. So this is looking at action 13, which was, should we be focusing more of our transportation capital on sort of local community projects, like if we're seeing less commuting to the downtown and more activity in people's local communities. And so she did a whole bunch of really good work in terms of, pulling data from multiple sources to try and give us some sense of what the changes actually were. Unfortunately, we just haven't had the staff resources or the funding to do this on a consistent basis and to get some of the new data sources like aggregate cell data. We're still working on that. So that's been a challenge. And it's a little hard to make certain recommendations in some of those secondary actions. But in principle, I think it laid out what a really great monitoring report could look like for doing this sort of work. And then the intent was that this was going to be a living report. And you can see here that there were sort of 3 points that we wanted to do updates. And this was based on our understanding of the situation back mid-2020. There had been some concern that COVID and the flu might not play well together. Fortunately, that didn't play out because the flu basically went into hiding, thanks to all the masking and social distancing. So the first and second update might have been combined. I was actually transferred to working on our more immediate COVID response, so I wasn't able to put the time to doing the updates. At the same time, our corporate team has actually come up with some corporate-wide scenarios. So what we're looking at doing now in terms of an update of these scenarios is, rather than updating them as they are, is actually updating them and incorporating them into the set of corporate scenarios. And that will actually, I think, really would enable that discussion about how does what we found potentially affect other services across the city. And then just as a closing thought, and one of the reasons I really like strategic foresight is just this thought is that if we don't like what we're seeing in the future, that this gives us the opportunity and I think the responsibility to try and change it for the better. And so it's really, again, about driving action to help create the future that we want. And with that, I think I'm right on time. Yes. So any questions? Certainly happy to answer any questions right now. Also have my contact information here on the screen. I included my LinkedIn link just because I do have a copy of the report that we presented to council last year on my LinkedIn. So if anyone wants a copy right away, you can download it there. I'm also happy to pass that on to Usman so he can circulate it.
Thank you, Eric. It was a great presentation. You gave us a lot to think about. So I now open the floor for questions. You can either unmute yourself and ask a question, or you could also write a question in the chat box and I can read it on your behalf.